room for you and me. The future of hell belongs to the Vees.
Serious?
Right. If you're here, then you saw the title, so I won't bore you with too lengthy of an intro outside of a few opening thoughts. I am here to give my 2 cents on the unholy trinity that is the Vees, and I will happily do so. Especially since I believe that they won't be surviving the next season. Or one of them won't be, anyway. And I know a lot of people like these 3, but I'm not really one of them. So when they do get their comeuppance and fall from their tower, I may just pull a Carlton and break out into a little happy dance. But before I get into how I think the Vees will go down, I would like to comment on a couple things if you will indulge me. For starters, their lyrics from the finale song.
After the battle, masterless cattle.
Okay. Who are these cattle you speak of? We don't have any evidence that the angels hit any other location besides the hotel, and based on Rosie's expression, I think most of the cannibals made it out of the fray with a new palate that can only be described as divine. So I have my doubts that sinners will be flocking to the Vees in the aftermath.
Overlords hanging by a thread.
I hate to break it to you, but the only overlord that took any damage was Alistair, and he's clearly fine. You would know this if you had checked any of your drones instead of singing, went outside to touch grass, or, better yet, simply looked out the window, you red-eyed, flat-faced, big-toothed mofo.
With a bit of bravado, maybe tomorrow we'll be atop the heap.
Actually, you know what? With a little bravado, you guys may end up on top, but you have to contend with literally everyone else. Alistair, Zilla, and Carmilla are obvious powerhouses, and even though we haven't seen too much of the dino, I have the distinct feeling that she could rip an opponent to shreds with very little effort. Rosie now has an army of cannibals that are equipped with angelic steel, and I'm certain that she can go from Mary Poppins to Hannibal Lecter at the drop of a hat.
You can quote me on that.
And then we have Zestial Mord, whose mere presence exudes fear, and since he's about 600 years old, he's got plenty of experience and power to fall back on if he needs it. Now, that is quite the competition, and none of them are simply going to roll over for a trio of, as Carmilla puts it, smug wannabes. Oh, and by the way, that's before you consider the fact that the popularity of Rosie, Carmilla, and the hotel will likely skyrocket in addition to the truth about Serpentius eventually coming out, and everyone then knowing that redemption can indeed happen. Even if the Vees don't attack the primary cast in a direct manner, I don't think they'll have the high ground. Especially if Lucifer will have more of a presence, which, if the top section of the newly rebuilt Has-Been Hotel is anything to go by, he just might. There's also the obvious ally in Emily, which may give Charlie some extra divine protection alongside her dad. Hardly something to sneeze at considering how powerful the Seraphim are. Oh, and one more thing, I'd also like to comment on this for a moment.
The boys and I have come up with a full assault plan.
Oh, really? What kind of assault plan do you have? Sit on your asses and snatch whatever's left from the carnage? That hardly sounds like overlords that aren't afraid to fight, and more like vultures. Although, one of them is almost a Zuckerberg-Bezos parody in a manner similar to these two, but without their quirky charms that make them so enjoyable.
I am eccentric, and must therefore do eccentric shit!
The second is a sadistic Asmodeus cosplayer who's one kink or temper tantrum away from becoming Pinhead.
We have such sights to show you.
And the third is what you see when you look up the definition of diva in the dictionary. So calling them vultures is rather fitting. Honestly, sometimes these scripts just write themselves. And now that my commentary is done with, let's start with the member of the Vees that gets the most flack, and rightfully so, to be fair. Valentino. Because out of the 3 Vees, Val is by far the most scummy. He's got a major issue with his anger and will go from 0 to 100 at the slightest inconvenience, with the only things being able to keep him content is those around him following his orders to a T, Vox giving him alternatives to vent at, or simply being violent. The only individual that he seems to keep himself somewhat calm with is Charlie, and that's probably due to her being the Princess of Hell. Val is a hot-headed POS, but I think even he knows better than to get on Lucifer's bad side. That beating he gave Adam was legendary, and I would hate to be hit by that fiery spirit bomb, but even then, Val can't help but simply be himself in the creepiest way possible. Which honestly makes me wonder what his plan would have been if he had attacked the hotel like he wanted to initially. Even if Alistair wasn't there to defend it, I highly doubt he would have done much damage before he heard Lucifer's wings flapping in the distance. Also, sidebar for just a moment, We see that Val has Vizarali bots doing his bidding, which raises the question if Mammon charged him more for these bots since he's not a Hellborn, but he's also an Overlord. It would seem to fall into the greedy bastard's personality. It also makes me wonder how many people he had to shred before they decided to get him bots. I can just imagine Vox going, "Okay, I am tired of replacing our staff. Let's get him robots, they're easier to replace and harder to damage." Velvette's model was also just a random person that happened to be near him when he blew his gasket, so I can only imagine the things he'll dish out to those that are under his direct employ. So it's very likely that his anger is what will send him packing in the end, but the real question is, who will be the one to deliver the final blow? Considering that Valentino controls his emotions as well as Will Smith controls his hands, and the fact that he's not favored by any member of the primary cast, gives us quite the lineup that will happily end him and deliver his remains to Rosie for a pie. Or maybe use his wings for decoration. I personally think that Angel will break his ties with Val in some form or another, and when Val comes to confront him, Angel and Husk will launch Nifty at him like a missile. That scene in the club was only a teaser to what could be Nifty's finest moment. You know, beyond avenging Penchus by killing Adam. So even though he uses his rage, brute force, and hedonism that ranges from basic to barbaric to get his way, Valentino is going to learn that the harder you squeeze, the less you'll have in the end. Actually, all three of them may end up learning that in the end. And complete domination is by far the greatest tool that the Vees have, but it's also their greatest weakness, as history has demonstrated that using that type of power can only go so far before you get major pushback. And if you use underhanded tactics, you could be surrounded by a mob ready to rip you to pieces when your number is finally up. Which transitions us to the greedy TV screen himself, Vox. And I'm not quite sure why, but for some reason, Vox gives me Major Karen vibes. Is it because he's a massive control freak whose eyes bulge and go red whenever he gets a hint of ill news? Or because he uses every outlet possible to talk smack about and slander those he dislikes? It's hard to say, really, but if you do get this kind of vibe from Flat Screen here, or if you get a different vibe altogether, do tell me in the comments below. And if you're liking the video so far, do let me know by hitting that like button the same way Adam hits up McDonald's. And perhaps subscribing. When it comes down to it, I can see why the shipping for Vox and Mothman is as popular as it is. In terms of personality, they're about the same. Both want total control over anyone they can get their hands on, and expect them to follow their orders without question or complaint. They both exploit just about everyone they come into contact with and have an enormous issue with their anger. Although, unlike the master of the pimp slap, Vox's anger seems to have a wider range. The 1080p demon did take out all the power from Pentagram City because Alistair just slightly pushed his buttons. I mean, it barely took any time, and I don't think his tone of voice changed once before Vox blew his fuse. Stayed gone is only 3 minutes, Al does not chime in until 1 minute 28 seconds, and Vox causes the blackout in under a minute. You have really got to give credit to Radio Antlers where it's due. Even more so that it took almost no effort on his part to make that happen, and based on how easily the tables were turned, I look forward to seeing what will happen between them further down the road. However, this does make me wonder about one thing.
You still pissed he almost beat you that time?
How much power does the flat screen actually have, because Alistair is powerful in his own right? This is something that we get to see firsthand in how he was able to hold his own against Adam for as long as he did. However, he loses points since he attacked without angelic steel. We all know that Alistair isn't stupid, but it's clear he belongs in the Pride Ring based on his hubris in that moment. And Vox's ability to control others could give him a leg up later on in the show, as he wouldn't need to fight head on. So while Val uses intimidation to keep himself safe, Vox can avoid a fight altogether and vanish in the chaos. This also raises the question of how far his ability to control others can go, and if some are simply immune to it for whatever reason. And should that fail him, he's got his own brand of fast traveling should chaos erupt around him. But since we haven't seen him use much of his power, the extent of what he can do is up in the air at the moment, and we'll simply need to wait for future episodes to find out more. I can't quite see how he'll go down, but a good friend of mine has helped me iron out some details for a few theories about this show, and he suggested that Alistair will trap Vox inside of a device, most likely a TV, and keep him in his radio tower. It's a form of torture that is not only fitting for Vox, but hilariously ironic, since it would look like he's trapped inside of himself. A Voxception, if you will. Or, alternatively, his temper will be used to put him in such a vulnerable position, he'll end up basically digging his own grave. And finally, the one that has the best chance of outlasting the other two, Velvette. Now, on a more personal level, Velvette is by far my least favorite of the three, based around the omniversal-sized ego that she carries around in that hair of hers. Although, funnily enough, she's one of the few characters in the show who can out-ego Adam. However, despite my subjective disliking of Velvette's persona, when it comes to looking at her objectively, she is by far the most competent of the three V's. Based on how she appears to work Hell's social networks when she claims that she's the backbone of the three, she may be exaggerating to a degree, but you can't quite say she's incorrect either. She also gets points for being the only one of the three that can keep her emotions in check and is able to play just about any situation, at least based on what we've seen so far, to her advantage. That Overlord meeting is by far the best example of this, as she poked and prodded Carmilla in just the right way. Very Alistair of her as well. But Carmilla Carmine and Zestial Mord are two individuals whose bad sides I would personally avoid. You know, unless you want to be stuck in an eternal nightmare or be eviscerated by the deadliest legs this side of the pentagram. By the way, one detail that came up when I was writing this script is that each of the V's appear to mirror three members of Hell's royalty from Hell the Boss. I was initially going to say that Velvette is like Beelzebub, but after thinking about it for more than 5 seconds, I'd say she's more like Stella. Valentino is obviously a poor man's Ozzy, and Vox is a stand-in of sorts for Mammon. Which, when I say that out loud, it makes me think that if Penchus had gotten into the good graces of the V's like he had wanted to, Vox would be exploiting him in the same manner as Mammon exploited Fizzarali. And considering that both characters are voiced by Alex Brightman,
Now that is irony.
One other thing I noticed is that every character that appears on screen during the final song contributes to the lyrics except for Velvette. Based upon how she was fixated on her phone whilst her colleagues were scheming and lounging, this to me seems to hint at her possibly betraying the other two or finding a way to move beyond them. Velvette already openly dismisses the other overlords in claiming that they need to essentially get with the program or step aside. It is no accident that she took the seat directly opposite of Carmilla at the end of the table. So, with that being said, what's to stop her from taking down Val, or Vox, or both, with underhanded tactics, or maybe allowing them to fall and leave only her at the top if she's come to believe that they're not trending enough anymore? I mean, it is something worth thinking about, and since she only sweeps into the song at the very last minute to join her two compatriots and chuckle with them, all but confirms this for me. No words, just a devilish grin and a snicker. But her arrogant flaunting put her in a not so favorable position with Carmilla and Zestial, which will most likely come back to bite Velvette in the ass. Maybe that, or perhaps one of the other V's will take her down after she tries something sneaky against them. Because even though she can play situations so they work out in her favor in one way or another, I believe that Velvette, not unlike the other two, will end up orchestrating her own downfall since she has enough hubris to make Perseus blush. When it comes down to it, there are various ways these three could go out, and I am very intrigued to see how that will happen. Alistair did promise us that the V's race has been run and that he's going to take pleasure in hitting them, or at least Vox, hard. Or maybe they'll attack the hotel and Charlie will call in a favor from Sir Penchus the White. And maybe throw in that little cinnamon bun for good measure. So that was just my thoughts on the V's and how they're done for, and I hope all of you enjoyed it. If you think I'm onto something and want to share how you think they'll go down, or possibly add to the scenarios presented in this video, please share it in the comments section below. And if you liked what you heard, please hit that thumbs up and subscribe for what I've got coming next. Godspeed, and I hope to see each of you in the next installment.